Gwaib sydd y wyn, Daliwizi, Ann Pollard Ranco, Nugabunawupske Nia, Nujayao, Orono, Maine, Nuga Wiki, Brooksville, Maine. Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Ann Pollard Ranco, and I'm a citizen of the Penobscot Nation. I grew up in Orono, and I'm currently living in beautiful, what is now known as Brooksville, but ancestral territories of Penobscot. Today, I am very honored to have been asked to moderate this panel and so excited to introduce you all to our speakers. First, just a little orientation as to what we will be discussing today. This is a conversation about the process and learnings from land return, particularly from a non-Native organization to a Native American land trust, and how it connects to the broader movements of land return across Wabanaki homelands. And there are going to be some really thought-provoking conversations and hopefully rich questions that will be answered. And overall, we really hope that this will be an opportunity and a space for learning and furthering of non-Native land trusts' understanding of how land return policy actually happens by sharing the story of the land return to Bomazeen Land Trust. In addition, we really hope that this will be an opportunity to create space to build ideas between our incredible panelists from Wabanaki nonprofit and tribal governments around the ongoing issues and questions in the broader land return movement. So without further ado, I would love to turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves to you. I'm sure you're familiar with all of these names, but let's get started. So I'll turn it over to Mali.
Kwemsue, Delusi Mali Obomsawin, Nuichi Odanak, Nwigi Blesmani Menahan. I am a citizen of Odanak First Nation. My name is Mali Obomsawin. I live on French Island. We do have a word for French Island in the language. And I grew up in traditional Abenaki territory in Western Maine. I was Oswagodam as well. And I am the executive director of Bomazeen Land Trust, a longtime organizer for Indigenous Wabanaki rights and cultural reclamation across the territory. Happy to be here, Leonie. I'll pass it to Lokotah.
Hi, my name is Lokotah Sanborn. I am the secretary of Bomazeen Land Trust. I'm a Penobscot community organizer, and yeah, I'm just very excited to be here to speak to you all and with you all about land return, land access, and sovereignty more broadly as well. I've been involved in spaces for a long time, organizing around racial and environmental justice. And land access is a big part of that, definitely. But yeah, I'm excited to get into it today, and I will pass it over to Brett.
Thanks, Skoda. Thanks, Molly. Thanks, Ann. Thanks, everybody. I'm Brett Ciccotelli. I'm one of First Light's core staff people. So there are three of us who are our sort of core staff. I'm a non-native person who lives near Frenchman Bay over here, to eastern part of this region. My work for the last year or so has been to sort of support and assist, as asked, the Wabanaki Commission on Land and Stewardship, and Indigenous nations as partners in the land return and to the act of land return. And it looks kind of different across each case, and we'll talk about that, I guess, as we go through. But that's who I am and what I do right now. And I'll pass to Isaac, the eye down there.
I'm Isaac St. John, the giant eye on your screen. I am the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians, and I'm a member of the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians. And I am part of the Wabanaki, I don't remember what the name of the commission is, Wabanaki Land and Stewardship Commission, I believe. And I don't know who, I guess pass it to Ethan.
Thanks, Isaac. Hi, everybody. I'm Ethan Miller. I am a settler descended person from Irish and German ancestry. I'm a co-coordinator of Land in Common, along with my fellow workers, Autumn Fitch and Jesse Sapphire. And I'm a fruit tree grower. I live with my family on in a housing cooperative on Land in Common land in what's now known as Green, just north of Lewiston. Land in Common is a community land trust. We were founded about 16 years ago and focus on reconnecting people and land in ways that enact healing and justice and support land-based livelihood. Started out as an all-white led project, and we've been transforming ourselves as an organization over the last 5 years, and this work is a big part of that, and a lot of folks here on the call have been a big part of that, and really great to be here with y'all today.
Thanks so much, everybody. It's really great to see all of your faces on one screen. I wish we could all be together in real life, but it's great that this context allows for so many attendees, and it's just really great to have everybody here. And thank you so much to the audience members for tuning in. So before we get into the more specific story of this land return, I'd like to open it up for conversation about the trends that panelists are observing in land return within Wabanaki communities, and specifically Wabanaki nonprofits and to Wabanaki governments. How do you see this land return happening in homelands throughout these different pathways right now?
Yeah, it's always who wants to get started on that one. Yeah, I mean, I feel that we're in like a really important time right now, where, over the course of the last several years, we've seen a lot of gains being made in terms of people's openness, landholders, especially openness to work with the tribes and work with Wabanaki community members and Wabanaki organizations to expand land access, but also to really foster relationships to be able to return lands outright. I think that there's a lot of hope that I see. There's a lot of hurdles still, but I think that we're a long ways further than we were, even just 2 years ago, 3 years ago, especially like, 10, 20 years ago. I think we're in a very important moment, and it's very exciting. I think it's very challenging too. But yeah, I think that people's ability to work with people from the communities has gotten a lot better in recent years. And I'll just leave it there.
As a person on the commission that has been the recipient of, not me specifically, but the tribes, recipient of land back, I think it's gone a lot smoother in terms of being able to get the process going and get our interests within the land back process. So rather than receive donations of land in the middle of nowhere that really doesn't have any sort of importance to us, we're able to talk to people like Brett and the commission, specifically Brett, because he's been, a great help in this whole process, to sort of pinpoint culturally important and economically important land that would benefit us by going after, rather than just getting any sort of land that, might come our way. So it doesn't feel like we're sort of scrounging for scraps, but we're actually going towards pieces of land that are actually what we want.
I think I agree with everything else that's been said, so I won't repeat anything. It's similar for the land trust, so not transferring land directly to one of the nations. But for the experience of Bomazeen Land Trust, we have the same issues in terms of landholders not understanding our priorities or what kind of lands are actually useful or desired to us. So that is definitely something we can get into more today as well. But I also wanted to just mention that I think we do also sometimes get stuck in process in terms of like how would the best way to transfer land be, to return land be, and how do we get around these hurdles like easements or other kinds of legal parameters that have been attached to land sometimes generations before we even started thinking about this. So
those are all really great questions that I think we'll have an opportunity to follow up on a little bit later after the story weaves together. So I was thinking this might be a great opportunity to start by talking about the land return to Bomazeen and like what happened and how did it happen. So I'll open it up to that discussion.
who wants to start this one?
That's a good question. I feel like, how far back do we want to go?
1661.
Yeah, 16. So in the 1600s, no. So we've been in conversation and building relationship with Land and Common for a very long time, even like prior to Bomazeen existing. I've known Ethan for, oh God, it's been like 6 years, 7 years now. And we've been talking a lot about issues around land access, around sovereignty, especially, and yeah, I mean, this process has been moving for several years, just like building that relationship and building that trust. And yeah, I mean, when Bomazeen first got started, like it was with the help of Land and Common, with like a land justice fund that they had been fundraising or setting aside rather for many years to give to a Wabanaki organization, and us being from that area and really seeking to protect more of the lands in Western Maine, it just made a lot of sense. And so with that donation, that really allowed us to bring on Molly as staff, to allow her to be paid, because she was just doing everything completely volunteer. And yeah, I mean, it's a long story with many twists and turns, but I would love to pass it over to Ethan or Molly as well, to kind of talk more about that.
What do you think, Molly? I can give it a shot, and then you can. Yeah, thanks, Lakota, for starting that off. It's funny how history and stories work in our heads. There's like so many different versions that even circulate in us. Yeah, I think from Land and Commons. So Land and Commons started about 16 years ago, and early on, I think the folks who founded it recognized that we were living on stolen land, and recognized that that to live on this land with integrity, we had to respond in some way. But I think we didn't actually understand what that work meant or looked like. And so at the moment, what we did was we said, well, we should be paying some sort of reparations. So let's just set aside this $1,000 a year into a fund. We don't know who it should go to, because we bought into the story that Abenaki people were gone from this part of what's now called Maine. And so, in I think classic settler fashion, we sort of like wrung our hands, like we don't know what to do. But we set aside this money, and so by the time we were part of the second cohort of the First Light Learning Journey, and we heard Molly talk about Bomazeen, about Abenaki history in the region, and that was a real wake-up call for us to see, like, oh, Abenaki people are here, and we can and could have been in relationship this whole time. And so that was a moment when it felt like we need to step up and try and build a relationship with Bomazeen, and so we offered this fund that we'd been building, along with an ongoing commitment to be paying something annually, that we connected to the Treaty of Casco in 1678, where Wabanaki diplomats basically said, you can stay here, but you got to pay a peck of corn per settler family every year as kind of an honor tribute. And so we figured we owe a lot of corn. And so that I think that offering really started to deepen a relationship. And so our boards met together to kind of get to know each other a little bit. And that really opened the conversation about land return. And meanwhile, Land in Common was in this place of trying to transform ourselves, trying to think about where we wanted to go next, recognizing that, land justice requires leadership from those most impacted by injustice and dispossession and colonialism. And we heard a lot of incredible, courageous feedback from Wabanaki organizers and other organizers of color in Maine. Maybe your organization shouldn't exist. And we took that seriously and, thought about what does it mean to be a landholding organization run by settlers, in this colonized place. And so that was really part of the conversation of saying to Bomazeen, should we transfer all of our land to Bomazeen and then basically have some sort of like use agreement to live on the land? And at the time that didn't really make sense because Bomazeen, I mean, you all can speak to this, but was really focused on Wabanaki land reconnection and not managing leases for settlers. And so really out of those conversations, we sort of emerged the plan for this first land return of 184 acres of wild land that Land in Common at that point held here in what's now called Green.
Oh, go ahead, Anne.
Go ahead, Molly.
Okay. I was just gonna, I don't know that I have a lot more to add on that origin story other than I just wanted to kind of underscore a couple of things that were really key to setting up an eventual transfer. Obviously, one was Land in Common folks' sort of awareness of living on stolen land, being a landholder in Wabanaki territory and not being Wabanaki. I also think that knowing exactly who to reach out to can be a challenge for folks and is always a moving target. I think, to be super frank about the way that Wabanaki relationships are among the nations and our needs and what we share, which is a lot. In the area where Land in Common returned land, it's in central Maine, it's in Green, which is traditionally Abenaki territory, which typically we associate with Odanak and Willenak First Nations, who were displaced to Quebec through the colonial wars. But other people who were displaced also went to Penobscot and Passamaquoddy, and so we do have sort of Abenaki descendants who are enrolled in the other Wabanaki tribes there as well. And, we're all related to each other as well. And so being able to know, I think as I recall, Ethan's group was like, well, we want to wait until we have an Abenaki contact to return this land to, because we know that we're in Abenaki land. And I don't know that that's always necessary when there are other, federally recognized tribes, nations here as well. But we did appreciate the timing of it because we had just formed our land trust. And I think that for all organizations working in what is now called Maine, but in various parts of Wabanaki territory, it's important to be really familiar with the traditional tribal lands maps.
Absolutely. I think that a common thread that I'm hearing is that relationship building and sort of understanding who and when and the presence that continues on the land. And sort of talking about this journey of the return of the piece of land in Green, Maine, a few things come to mind. Each land return project happens in a specific context and certainly has its own hurdles and lessons. but I think it also connects to the broader movement of land return. So when you're looking at this broader context, how do you see some of the lessons or remaining challenges that were revealed in the process of this land return to Bomazeen?
Yeah,
Sorry.
and I think that this question also like can be extended to beyond just Bomazeen, but also like I want to hear from Isaac on that, like how if there have been any hurdles too, or obstacles that have been like learning processes through the land returns that are either like have happened or are ongoing for your nation. But at least in our context, like one of the big hurdles that I think that we're coming up time and time again against as Wabanaki people is around conservation easements. They really put restrictions on land, which are like, it just flies in the face, at least in my perspective and understanding of what tribal sovereignty means. It's something that's really difficult to undo. It's nearly impossible to undo easements. And so within the context of this transfer, there wasn't like exactly an easement necessarily, but there was I forget the legalities. Ethan, help me out there. It's like a term for what it was.
Yeah, it turned out that we were intending to return all the land with no restrictions. We were really clear about that as an intention. It turns out that 20 acres of the land is encumbered by a declaration of trust, which
Right.
Land in Common inherited from a previous organization. And so there was no legal way to return the land with, there was no way to remove that immediately. But we did end up working together to create a memorandum of agreement between the organizations. So when the land was returned, that memorandum basically says that over the next year, we're going to work together with our legal teams to try to remove the declaration of trust, or at least to try and revise it so that Bomazeen is the entity that's actually sort of administering that legal document or device.
Yeah. Exactly. So like
we all have a lot to learn about how exactly it works, but
yeah. Yeah, and I feel like that there's just like this level of bureaucracy that when really I feel like when held under a microscope like kind of tends to fall apart into obscurity around a lot of these restrictions that exist. And so we're always kind of coming up against those things. And yeah, there's been other opportunities that we've like been assisting Land in Common with when it comes to like acquiring other spaces where like yeah, all of a sudden like we find out that there's an easement on land somewhere, right? Like I think that that's something that's a recurring hurdle that exists for us as an organization, but I also yeah don't want to talk too much and want to open that up to others as well, and also to Isaac if there's things for the nation that you've seen as well.
Yeah, I can talk on that. So in terms of hurdles, I think the overall arching issue is that it's essentially a clash of two different ideas of how land should be used and land should be accessed. The indigenous ways is obviously a much more open to, generational use, generational understanding that the land is going to be used in different ways, which comes up against this sort of idea that it should be used in a specific way, given to specific people, and be fenced off to certain people so that it doesn't fall within people that you don't want using, if that makes sense. Give me 1 second, my computer's telling me some stuff right now. Going to more specifics, we recently had what was potentially a big land acquisition for the tribe itself out on Rockabima Lake, if anybody knows where that is, west of west southwest of Holton. Southwest, yeah, west southwest of Holton, near Picket Mountain. The woman that was going to donate the land was ready to donate the land, and then through events outside of our care and outside of our hands, the whole process broke down, and what had been months and months of work is now essentially down the drain, and became a number of issues going on: land covenants, restrictions on land use after it was transferred, and a breakdown of just the respect and understanding that goes between someone who's donating to the land back movement and the people that are receiving the land back. And I don't want to, speak on that part of sort of the mindset that that person might have been in, but from our standpoint, it was more of a affront to our sovereign ability to manage our own land in the ways that we saw fit. That was outside of how they saw the land being used. So the biggest hurdle is we've had so far someone thinking that they had a better way for the land to be used than what we were intending on, and then the whole deal falling apart. So that's our biggest hurdle. I don't know if that really affects anybody else, but and if I missed anything out, Brett, be sure to please chime in and sort of help out.
No, I think that's a great explanation of and I think something Ethan said about the discovery of that trust, what was the deed of trust you said, or but then the relationship that existed between Land and Common and Bomazeen, obviously it worked through that, right? And so that's like I think it's an interesting, I think it ties what Isaac just said together in sort of a practical sense, and sort of how important it is for the trust to be there. One thing to Ann, to your theme question here about like the movement, one thing that I think is really, really cool about what Bomazeen and Land and Common did together here, and I think what ties to something Isaac said earlier around like the commission being at a place where it's more of a sort of there's properties that matter for whatever reason being asked for help to acquire them or whatever it may be, that's happening. But a lot of them are these acquisitions that are help. There's a lot of help, which is great, but they're not the same as what happened in this case, where this is land that was owned by Land and Common that changed ownership, and it's a pretty different thing. And I just bring it up because in a movement sense, it's a different piece of the movement. And I think it's really important to have exactly what Isaac's talking about, which is like, here's a priority, here's a piece, can we have help? Is there help here to sort of turn this new acquisition into a land back project? But I think the other piece of it is sort of inspiring by what happened here is because this is within, and the people on this call we know many of them, where we know our peers in these land owning organizations, like there's a big number when you look at acres of land that's already owned, and it's just a different thing. Again, it's all important, but in the movement space, I think this Bomazeen return really, really demonstrates that piece of the movement, which can have the same thing that Isaac's saying, the same direction from the indigenous nations or indigenous partners, but it's looking into sort of what's already owned, not what's available on the market. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this would be a great opportunity to open up to a little bit of discussion about that. Land and Common being a bit of a smaller organization, and how is this story analogous to large funded organizations that, have more land, financial resources, and, staff power to contribute to this work. So if anybody would like to voice in on that.
I think it's really important, to underscore. I think someone calculated what percentage of the Land and Common land was actually transferred. It was a massive percentage because you guys are small. And I think it's a good example to set for all of these much better funded and much more equipped large conservation groups. And you know, sort of the like pretext of colonialism, right, is the idea that settlers would better use the land than native people, right? And so like, yeah, of course, we're like still kind of living through that and this process of trying to undo the violence of colonial land theft. And it happens in our day-to-day interactions as people in the movement. And it's always really disheartening. And we have to kind of remind ourselves like we are not experiencing the worst of it, right? Like in this generation of us. But you know, when colonists came and started surveying the land, like they immediately started marking it up and putting, you know, these lines and these encumbrances over it, you know, changing forms over time. But all of the sort of easements that we have now and the restrictions of the past are cumulative, right? And so we're actually dealing with like 400 years worth of like legalities and a legal structure that's being built on marking up and claiming our land, and claiming rights to our land. And so, you know, we're actually kind of lucky that we were dealing with 180 acres and only had one little corner of it with, you know, 20 acres of something that we were like, we're not going to let this stop us from going forward. We're going to move forward with the transfer and we're going to make this commitment to get help from people who have more resources and understanding of these laws. But, you know, that's our case. And probably all of the land trusts on this call, like, have the resources and the better, you know, sort of legal grounding and understanding of how to deal with easements and things like the Declaration of Trust. And so I think it's, I guess, important to highlight that you're all already better suited to confront these problems than we were and we are. Something that we've kind of run into in a lot of the conversations with larger land trusts actually about giving land that they're already holding is sort of, well, we don't, you know, there's all these easements and we don't have like the same kind of rights over all the pieces of land that our conservation group owns or holds. And from my perspective, like, I'm like, oh, well, you also have like a full team of people to figure that out and not make us figure it out or let that get in between justice happening.
It's complicated.
Well,
It's just so complicated.
Yeah, well, I wanted to build on that because I think that's such an important point, Molly, and we can't hide behind it's complicated. And I just, like, I so distinctly remember standing on the side of Berry Pond with you, Molly, and you know, I was narrating some whole thing about how it was really complicated, and you were like, "No, it's actually really simple. Like, this is my homeland, and your organization is occupying it, and like, here we are without land in our own homeland. Like, return it. It's simple." And I think that really struck me. I mean, I carry that moment with me all the time, and appreciate your directness and courage in just saying that to me. And I think that, yeah, I mean, the colonial structure creates layers and layers and layers of complexity, and then we can hide behind that as a justification for continuing that same way of operating. And the reality is, you know, I think it's simple and it's not easy. And, you know, we can acknowledge that it's not easy, but then the question of where should the burden of that hard work actually sit? And yeah, just to amplify, like, organizations that have the resources to do that hard work and to carry that burden need to be doing that so that we can come to the table with clarity about what it is that we're really offering. And so that internally we're doing that transformation work to be able to offer more and more. And you know, I think for another piece is the desire for control and, you know, that arrogance to think that we know how to manage the land. And like, for me, I need to sit in this reality that there's a 20,000 plus year old conservation movement that's called Wabanaki People and Nations. And my people have primarily been a force of land destruction. And then, you know, at the last minute, when it's like maybe too late. A few people are like, oh my God, we have to stop ourselves from destroying the land. And so we come up with these convoluted tools to like, lock the drugs in the cabinet so that we don't have access to them because we don't trust ourselves with the land because we're not trustworthy. And meanwhile, there's people on this land who have been caring for it, who have been defending the land from my people for 400 plus years. What better people to continue to care for that land? So like as a conservation organization, if our mission is to care for the land return is the pathway to actually do that responsibly.
Yeah, and just really quick, Ethan, what do you remember what the percentage was in terms of like the land that was returned at the time?
It was 50%.
So 50%. So like imagining this, right, where obviously something that Isaac had said earlier, right, where it's like it's not always feasible for tribes and our people, our nations to just get land back wherever, right? But that's also not an excuse. I'm not giving you guys ammunition here. But just imagine for a moment, right? 50% of the land holdings, right? And that's not just from a small organization like Land in Common, but imagining 50% of your organization, the people that are listening right now, of your organization's holdings, what that would mean to come back to Wabanaki people, right? And, when we're thinking about the amount of land that is held by conservation and community land trusts across the state, what is that, like almost a quarter of land or something like that of private land holdings? And so there's this massive amount of our homeland, right, of our relatives, of lands that we have not been able to access for the last 400 years, right, that is being occupied, is being held behind these layers of obscurity. And again, obviously, in certain instances, it's not always feasible for a tribal nation, mostly on economic grounds, I would say, not to take lands back or having them be so far away because tribes have been displaced through colonialism, right? But again, that's not an excuse. And I think that there's a lot to be learned through the ability to give up what has been stolen and is being held currently, right? There's been a lot of projects, like Brett said, where there are new acquisitions that have happened in the past several years, or new acquisitions that are unfolding right now of lands that, like, obviously the nations have been like, this is the area that we're focused on, and that's a good thing. Those are positive things, but also looking internally at like, what do we have currently? Oh, wow. I don't know what that is. What do we have currently? I guess Zoom thinks I'm on fire, but that we can give back. And with that, I think, yeah, Zoom's telling me that I need to pass it along to somebody else.
Going off what Lakota said, it's not that we don't want the land, obviously. It's that from the tribal perspective side, we're, unable to attend to the land that the land needs to be attended to, the level of which the land needs to be attended to. Whenever our tribe, the Maliseet tribe, gets new pieces of land, I myself have to go out and look at the land to see if there's any sort of cultural resources that need to be immediately protected and what can be sort of put off until there's more time to protect that stuff to our best ability. And if we have, a piece of land that's on the other side of the state, it's not feasible for my department and the tribe to send me out there to see if it'll if it's there's anything on there that's worth protecting in the immediate sense. So while all land back would be great, we just have to think about it in terms of the Western economical standpoint of time and funding.
Thank you, everybody, for expressing those points and sort of circling back a little bit to this conversation about easements and restrictions on land, especially when conservation organizations are constantly acquiring new holdings and then putting these easements on the land, deed restrictions. So a couple questions to branch off of that. Firstly, what needs to change within the conservation communities to really meet this call for land return in a way that's going to be sustainable and removing the barriers as much as possible? And to second that, is it possible, this is an audience question, is it possible legally to reverse or remove trust easements in order to do unrestricted land rematriation?
I have one really quick point to start, which is just like, if you're in the middle of establishing an easement right now, stop. Just like, don't do it, because like we mentioned, this stuff is cumulative and it's really hard to undo if it's possible. I'm gonna let someone else speak to that, but like, that's an act of colonization. And it like impacts generations beyond us. And we're struggling against it right now. So if you're in the middle of establishing new easements, please rethink that and don't.
Yep, I just want to echo what Molly said 100%. I think that you know, I understand why easements exist, and I understand like what Ethan was saying around like creating this problem in the first place and then trying to think of some kind of convoluted legality structure around it to protect the lands, right? Instead of doing kind of what would best protect those lands, people create these easements. And yeah, I think that they overwhelmingly have done very negative things in terms of Wabanaki sovereignty and our ability to express our autonomy and our cultural abilities and traditional practices on the land. And honestly, there's a lot of audacity, I think, within it too, where you know, people right now in this moment think they know what the world or that land is going to look like in 100 years, or what the needs of the people will be like in 100 years, given the climate catastrophe that we're in, that has been shaped by you know, has been shaped by capitalism, has been shaped by colonialism, and you know, conservation movements, though maybe have small gains. Looking back on it, it hasn't really saved us to where we are today, right? Like those easements haven't really protected us very much, have they? And so instead of further impeding Wabanaki land access, I would say to really halt the process, talk really deeply around kind of what Ethan had brought up too, around like that existential query of like, what is our organization doing? What are we driven by? Why are we driven by these things? Do we need to exist? And, you know, in Land and Commons case, we were like, yes, you do, because you are some of the only folks in this movement that really understand the complexities of what we're dealing with, and also are willing to show up as allies, willing to give what you have acquired, right, through processes of colonialism, and are actually willing and able to work with us, right? And like, we need you guys around in this movement for that reason, right? And so I would say, yeah, really looking at yourselves, but also like extending conversation and relationships out to Wabanaki people, to the commission, you know, to Bomazeen, to whatever group that exists, to really have these deep conversations and like build these relationships that we've been doing with Land and Common for the past like 7 years, you know, like it's just, yeah. And in terms of the legal structure, Brett, I wonder if you can speak to that, of like ending easements. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, you know, there are a law that the society created, right? So I mean, there are tools to amend kind of the way that law exists. I mean, I think there are lawyers in this call who probably thought a lot about this and haven't come up with satisfactory like paths out of it right now. But I just sort of, I offer that piece as like that's just the reality. It's something we created. You know, we created the sort of the modern Maine government and the US government created these tools, and the conservation community supported them and advocated for them. And you know, that can be a reverse process too. It may be hard. Lots of things are hard. That's not really to go to Lokotah's point earlier, like it can be an excuse, but it doesn't have to stop you. I mean, one thing too, I just think again, like, and Isaac, stop me if I'm going in a too different, if I'm sort of moving too too much of a connection here, but I do feel like your example too of that opportunity that fell apart towards the end, at least in this sort of version of what was happening, where the person was saying, the person said, I will only give with these conditions. What that led to was not having, explicit Wabanaki stewardship on that land. Versus there's a property that's sort of big in the news, been in the news a bunch with the Penobscot Nation, where they're acquiring 32,000 acres with the help of the Trust for Public Land. And the Trust for Public Land went to that relationship and said, we're not going to put restrictions on this thing that we're helping you acquire. And the nation is there, right? And that's going to lead to Wabanaki stewardship. So I just think it's like, again, it's like I don't want to just always make comparisons, but I think it shows like the outcome is showing what the sort of intention kind of breeds, right? Or what the intention brings. So, yeah, it just feels that it was resonating as you guys were all talking. So,
Yeah, and I think a lot of the biggest takeaway from this all is that this process allows us to go into these situations with more in our tool belt than what we have had in the past. So it doesn't feel like we have to take certain restrictions if they don't sit well with us. We can say, no, this doesn't work well, so we're going to step back and maybe something else will come up. So it doesn't feel like we're stuck with these sorts of agreements and sorts of easements. We are able to be more proactive in saying, we're gonna go a different way and not deal with this at the moment. So it definitely adds to the sovereignty of making these decisions on a level that we wouldn't have had 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It doesn't feel like we're, being forced to be in these situations. We're able to be in these situations where we want to be.
I just want to just add a couple things about easements and legal restrictions. I guess one is I think it's important. This is just building on what Mali and Lokotah were saying, but it's important to see the way that easements. A couple things. It's about that money. Like think about how that money is flowing, right? Like easements are another way of privatizing social wealth. So we're taking huge amounts of social wealth and putting it into the hands of individuals. And at the same time, we're doing that in a way that doesn't fundamentally challenge one of the core pieces of colonial land, land relationships, which is the commodification of land. We put easements on land that restricts certain uses, and the land is still a commodity. It's still bought and sold and treated as a thing instead of as a relationship or as kin. So we can think about what would happen if we channeled all that social wealth in other directions that actually took the land out of capitalism so that the land was no longer bought and sold, which obviously is a core part of Wabanaki understandings of land. And then also just, I guess maybe to get like much more practical, I think I just want to highlight that, we know that sometimes somebody wants to donate land or donate money to buy land, and they're going to put conditions on that. The donor's going to say, I'm only going to donate this money or this land if there's, a certain kind of restriction. So we have to recognize that there's only so much we can do to control that. But I think one thing that some folks from Bomazeen and Land and Common have been working back and forth on with some lawyers involved is to think about alternative legal language around deed restrictions. And so making a shift from restricting deeds to around what actions can be done. Because we have this arrogance to say like, oh, we can figure out what the land needs for the next 5,000 years and write it into a legal document. And the shift is to think about who is the land going to be in relationship with over the next many years. And so this alternative language is really about trying to make sure that the land, when it transfers, is transferring to another entity who's likely to be in good relationship with it, and making sure that Wabanaki nations and organizations are at the very top of that list. So it's a restriction on how the land gets transferred rather than what actually specifically happens on the land. And, and that's something that we're in the middle of actually renegotiating some deed restrictions with the donor so that we can return that land to Bomazeen in sort of a phase 2 of this land return, with restrictions that won't actually impact sovereignty. And we're happy to share that language and would love to be in more conversation with folks about developing that further. And also seeing how that logic could be applied in other ways too.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, like, one of the things that I feel comes up a lot from folks who like have this very defensive thing come out for them, where they're like, well, like, I've been doing that like for sometimes decades. I've been doing easement work, right? Like, what are some alternatives that I could be focused on? Like, what are other ways to protect land? And my short answer is, that's not my job to figure out for you. That, like, again, like Molly said earlier, like, a lot of times your organizations do have teams and have staff to be further researching other means of doing this. I had heard more recently that it was like during either the 80s or the 90s where there was kind of this question within the conservation movement in Maine around what are the best ways for us to protect lands, right? And there was people that were for easements, there were people that were against easements and proposing alternative ideas. And ultimately the easement conversation ended up winning out, right? And like also thinking about how it relates to like selective timber harvest and things like that as well within conservation. I think that there's no I don't want to get conspiratorial, but anyway, I feel like there's a lot of alternatives, and it's not up to me as an individual or up to Wabanaki people as individuals to like really come up with all of the parameters that work best for you. I think those need to be figured out in conversation for sure. And like Ethan said, like, we're working to figure out some of those things amongst ourselves, but by no means is that like up to Wabanaki people to like figure out the best way to protect lands outside of a conservation easement, you know?
Thank you all so much for expressing that. I feel like the relationships, the land is our relative, and that's just, as much of a relative as your mother or father would be to you, is how we as Wabanaki and Indigenous people feel about our relations to the land, and our non-human relatives who call that, and plant relatives who call that place home as well. Sort of zooming out, if we're looking at the map and broadening the expanse of Wabanaki territory and thinking about how this artificial border separates not only Wabanaki people from our Wabanaki relatives, but Wabanaki people from our land relatives as well across this border. And certainly the different legalities between the United States and Canada, and how these colonial nations have different structures that mean land return to Wabanaki and Abenaki people can be very different on different sides of the border. I'd like to ask you all, what do you see in terms of addressing this challenge?
I'll start. I would really be curious on Isaac's perspective on this too. But I participated in a meeting right on the other side of the border from the Penobscot Lake at the head of the west branch of the Penobscot River, but in the Canadian side this last summer. And I was with members of my nation, of Odanak, and our sister nation, the other Wabanaki Nation of Quebec, Wolanak, and some Wolastoqey relatives as well from the Canadian side. And we were meeting to discuss just this question, as well as members of the Nature Conservancy and some Canadian organizations that represent land conservation sort of equivalents up there, but it works very differently. Like Ann said, it's like a completely different system. And in addition to sort of a language barrier, there's like a legal language barrier, I guess you could say, in terms of how land is held. They don't really have, especially in Quebec, the same kind of sort of like public-private conservation ecosystem of organizations. And so it made conversations around land return to nations like so hard to start, to even begin, and to understand our options. And I think there's so far to go in that. It was almost difficult to even sort of educate the Canadian side, because it was such a different sort of language and process down here. And so that's difficult on that end. And I think that, again, like a lot of, especially the sort of multinational conservation groups that, you know, are in Maine and in Canada and elsewhere, y'all have a lot of work that you could do on that front. And I don't think it should necessarily fall on the very few, you know, Indigenous organizations based in landholding to do that work. But I will say that something that came up a lot for us in our conversations were looking for opportunities for the nations to hold land on this side of the border, but just abutting the border, right? So that if tribal nations from the Canadian side are wanting to cross with our Jay Treaty rights and access our traditional homelands on either side, and I think maybe the Maliseet folks might have thoughts on this too, and Mi'kmaq folks, people who are on both sides, that's definitely a desire. Especially because if you haven't been to Quebec, I'll tell you that most of Quebec is farmland and not good traditional land in south of the St. Lawrence, at least.
Yeah, it's two different languages, honestly. Even talking to people from Canada, they don't have the same sort of cultural preservation structure that we do here. And when I tell them what my position is, I have to explain further what it does and like what what it's there for. And just creating a baseline of understanding between both sides of the border the would be the first step of being able to understand land back to Canadian and US tribes, because as much as, you know, as much stuff as we have over here, it's I think we have it a little easier than the Canadian side in terms of getting stuff back, and that nation to nation understanding of land sovereignty and tribal sovereignty that they do on the Canadian side. And to change that, I think we'd have to go, you know, entirely top down, Canadian federal changes and then provincial changes and stuff like that. And at least from an archaeological perspective, the provincial government of like New Brunswick specifically isn't the most amiable to tribal interests. So it would definitely be very much an uphill battle to get the Canadian side on parity to the United States side, to be able to have this sort of back and forth. And, you know, as much as we complain about, you know, covenants and easements and stuff like that, it's miles ahead of what they have to deal with. And, you know, as much as I don't like the process of colonialism and stuff like that, I think they've gotten the short end of the stick in terms of the after effects of colonialism. So if we want to make it in terms of an equal relationship between both sides of the border, we have a lot of work to do. We as, you know, Indigenous people have a lot of work to do to make it so that it is equitable on both sides to be able to get homeland back. And that's well above my my knowledge pool to be able to fix that.
I think there's also something that's I really so value hearing everyone's piece on this. It's so important. But I think something, Molly, that you did last year, like you invited people to Odanak, right? People in the conservation work and landholding work here in what's now the United States. And I think even that sort of like, so that's connection, right? And that's sort of like recognizing that there's this, there isn't the artificial line that shrinks down into what Lakota was talking about can be blown up into the national line, or the modern national lines. And so just recognizing the connection, and then I often use a map series when I'm talking about some of the work that we're doing. And I'm kind of share real quickly. Do you guys mind if I like share the screen for a second? Okay. I just feel like I'm being moved by this, and I feel like that's kind of what we're up to a little bit. Usually I start with this one, or I start with this one usually, lineless, but I'm going to start with this one. So, this is like, this shows yellow, which is all this conservation land in now the state of Maine. It shows the national boundary and the state boundaries. It shows this bright green, which is land that's held in trust or fee by Wabanaki nations. And usually I like add to the map, but I'm just gonna go backwards because I feel like move that way. But like, this is just the conservation land. This is just the boundaries, the artificial geopolitical boundaries that are real, but you can't find them on the ground, right? And then just this visual of like how connected geography is and all that. So I think that's another piece. So like connecting with the place and with the existence of the place, but also seeing it differently feels really important to me. And the other stuff becomes the details, like all like that are hard. Like I'm not saying erasing lines from our minds is easy, but it's an exercise that it helps me in the personally, and that's maybe who I can speak the best to. But to imagine that space unlined, and maybe that gets to some of Lakota's points too around, returning land with all these different pieces that have been piled onto it. Yeah, and maybe it's an excuse to slow it down, not understand how to do it, but really like, those are just artificial lines that, we can maybe figure out how to peel off. But it shouldn't be like enough to stop our ability to visualize and sort of imagine.
So you could probably find the eastern border. They cut it out of the woods pretty straight.
Thanks, Isaac. And there's some rivers too. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thanks, Isaac.
Well, thank you all so much. I feel like this conversation has so many facets, and the work that we're all collectively doing is so multi-layered, and there are so many pieces that are weaving together, and like touching upon 10, 20 years ago, this work wouldn't have been possible. And there's an invigoration that comes with being a part of this momentum, and a responsibility as well to not only our ancestors who fought so diligently to have us be alive today. I actually, just a brief interjection, I'm using the Wabanaki student lounge at the University of Maine because I was having some Wi-Fi issues at home. But when I came in here, there was a quote on this whiteboard behind me that I feel really speaks to this conversation. And it's from one of my ancestors, Joseph Orno. And the quote says, "The British want to pen us up in a small place." Joseph Orno, Penobscot chief, 1776. And I feel like that has been a theme that has run into the following generations, including our generation. So it's really, really invigorating to be in this space with you all, holding this space and having these conversations where we are answering our ancestors, and we are also answering the future. So looking forward to the future, I wanted to also offer an opportunity to really talk about some of the ongoing momentum, not only within Maine, but within other organizations such as the Native Land Conservancy's approach. And how does this work continue? What are some things that inspire you to keep working towards land return? What do you imagine next, and what is needed to get there?
Okay, since no one else is starting. I feel like I have enough emotional distance from this because I'm in space. Um, the work that we do with like toward land return is like usually not fun. It's usually very exhausting. It's like not my preferred occupation. Until something, amazing happens and we get land back, and like that's the, it feels incredible. And then, we got to like kind of take that bullet for future generations who won't have to figure that out. And thank you for sharing that quote, Anne. I think that we are, yeah, that's like still what we're fighting against, although it's no longer the British, right? But like we are very penned up on the reservations or by these lines, these colonial borders. And I think that the work is, hopefully to like get rid of the fencing as much as possible, and hopefully to get lands back that are closer and closer to the community centers. It's like amazing that the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy nations have all this beautiful land out in Western Maine, but like how easy is it to like send your kids to go play over there? When you want them to grow up with access to their homelands and to be able to like pick fiddleheads and learn what a trillium looks like, right in the backyard, right? This is like really important stuff that's very crucial to our culture and the development of our identity and the preservation of our like community mindedness as well. Like all of the things that keep us in relation to each other and keep our cultures strong. So yeah, help us get more land back closer to home is really needed. And the rest of the time, I think when we're not doing this sort of like backbreaking work of trying to get land back, we're actually like rewarding ourselves by like reclaiming our ceremonies and our teachings and like learning our languages, right? Like we're doing all this stuff, and as much as we can pass off the backbreaking work to people who like get it enough to do it so that we don't have to, so that we can like learn how to make strawberry jam or whatever, like that's my vision, is that like I can actually just like go do some ceremony and I'll come back home and get on my computer and get this email like, hey, guess what? Congratulations, 25,000 acres right in your backyard has been returned to your nation. That'd be great.
Yeah, I think like alliance shifting in that way, right? Where people are like understanding kind of what we've talked about around, the things that they already hold, that map that Brett showed. Being willing to return those things in good conscience. But also, yeah, like taking up the work that's necessary in terms of like what Isaac was saying, like if there are things that can be done to support the nations in terms of land management, like why not do that? And like I just I hope that there's the ability to like pass off more of the logistics and the nitty-gritty of these things to build actual alliance and relationships and like deep bonds with people who are interested in protecting the land. I don't think there really needs to be this us versus them thing happening. Like us being Wabanaki, them being people in the conservation movement, right? Like there can be a lot more coalescing happening. And I don't want there to it to feel like there's this kind of pitting of enemies against each other, right? Like we all care about the same thing. And so I see a lot of those kind of barriers, not only in terms of the borders, in terms of the easements, but also like those borders that we construct in our minds too, around like what it means to live in a space, right? What it means to hold land, what it means to walk through life, holding on to things. And like, I don't know, for me personally, like I also think, if we're really caring deeply about the earth, we're really focused on preventing more climate catastrophe from happening, and like continuing on this road that we're on, then like we need to be tasked with challenging the status quo and challenging the systems that have allowed us to get to the point where we're at, right? Like we can't keep putting like holes, keep putting like band-aids over like these holes in the ship that we're just taking on water consistently, right? Like we need to actually be focused on challenging the systems of the colonial government and challenging capitalism as it exists as an economic model that is destroying the earth, right? Like we can is like I had said earlier, like a lot of the conservation that has happened, like that's not reversing where we're at right now, right? And like so there needs to be a really deep challenging of the systems, like politically. And I think that we all have our responsibility in that, to do that. So that's part of my hope and vision too, is that folks really start getting together and, you know, building movement around the things that will change the world for the better. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lakota. I yeah, I want to build on a few of those things. I think there's at least two really different ways to think about land return. I think that there's a way that's sort of like land return is something that settlers do for others. Land return is like an act of, we recognize this history of violence and we want to fix it. We want to kind of, solve, it's a problem that needs to be solved. And then that also becomes kind of a charity framework. Like we're gonna give land to Wabanaki nations who have had it stolen. That's all real. And I think there's another way to think about land return that is really, really crucial for settler people to step into, which is seeing land return as part of a movement, of a much deeper, wider movement to undo the core institutions and habits of colonialism that actually undermine and destroy us all. And I mean, I think this is to Lakota's point about it doesn't have to be us, them. Obviously, we come from really different histories and really different experiences, and we're impacted really differently. But the reality is that the paradigm of buying and selling land and treating it as an object is one of the root causes of all of the ecological devastation that we're experiencing, of so much of the social injustice that we're experiencing, of the destabilization of the planetary climate. Like, it is necessary for all of us to undo colonialism. It's not somebody else's problem. It's fundamental to the future of all of our children, all of our families, all of our ecosystems, all of our communities. And so for me, I think stepping into that feeling like we're all in it together and we have to figure out how to build solidarity together in this, recognizing our differences, honoring those, and showing up with the resources and power that we have in an honorable way with each other. And obviously that means that we can't just show up to this to like go to work. We can't just like show up for our conservation job. It means we also have to actually change ourselves at a fundamental level. We have to change how we actually live and how we're actually in relationship with each other every day. And I think that's some of the hardest and scariest work. The other piece that I just want to bring forward is that I think we also have to remember that this work has to include all of us. And we're living in a place where there are many displaced indigenous people who live on this land who are not Wabanaki, who were kidnapped from their homelands, who were forcibly displaced from their homelands. And they're here. I mean, this whole nation project is built on their labor and on their dispossession. And so making sure that when we talk about land justice, that we're centering Wabanaki communities for sure, but that we're also very much bringing to the fore all the other communities, Black, Brown, and Indigenous, who have been dispossessed and displaced, and that we're also bringing their priorities into the center and building solidarity. And, that white settler folks are showing up in ways to try and understand how can we support building solidarity across those communities in ways that don't play into the old divide and conquer sorts of dynamics that so easily get created when white folks are doling out the money or doling out the land. And, so that project of solidarity and how do we show up from the places where we are to really make that real.
Mm. Thank you so much. I feel like the commonality that extends throughout those responses is like the accountability, not only to organizations, but to ourselves, and ways that we can go forth in our everyday lives to hopefully make an impact, or at least inspire or enact change within our communities or within conservation organizations. So I think that's a really resounding message for you all to take away from this excellent conversation as we go back into our professional lives and are sitting around the table and having these discussions to, really open with intention of change, and like Ethan touched upon, centering Wabanaki voices and communities at the forefront. So I'm so appreciative. And I just wanted to offer one more opportunity for anybody to jump in and speak about the future of land return or anything else that sparks joy. Or it's sometimes, like Molly said, not so much joy in the process, but more in the results and when the land is finally returned. All right. Well, I wanted to thank everybody for being here. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Lokotah. Thank you so much, Ethan, Brett, Isaac, and Ellie, Kachiwali Winnie. And thank you, everybody in the audience, for sticking it out with us and being a part of this conversation.